Welcome to the Life Given podcast, your Monday morning edition, as we look into Black Lives Matter more specifically. What does it get wrong? And challenge the narrative. All this and more on today's show. Welcome to the Life Given podcast. I'm your host, Isaac Lopez. So on Friday's show, I said that I want to take a deeper dive in Monday's show into Black Lives Matter. I talked broadly about it, and I want to talk a little bit more broadly about it, setting the context for it for in this first segment, and then we'll get into just an example of how I think Black Lives Matter or where it goes wrong. Okay, so that's what I would like to do with today's show. And as you can tell in the title, it says Part 1. On Wednesday's show, I want to take into a look at what Black Lives Matter, what they may have right, what they're trying to do right. And so I don't want to just bash a movement without looking at both sides of the equation. And I think that's something good that Christians should remember during this time when it seems really easy to be guilt tripped into being on one side or feel the peer pressure being on the other, whichever side that may be for you. But just to remember before we get into all of this, Proverbs 1, where King Solomon writes, "Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So always be looking to pursue wisdom. What does it mean to be right in all of this? What does that mean to you? And what are you doing? What are you doing to understand the proverbs of today? What are you doing to understand the words of the wise and their riddles, or maybe the words of some fools? How are you understanding that all today? So that's just the verse I want to consider this morning as we jump into current events and the crazy issues that we have going on right now. So to begin, I just want to say how different the paradigms seem to be at the two parties at play here. So I think you have the Black Lives Matter movement on one side, and they have a very different paradigm than someone, say, like me, who's a Christian, who's also a conservative. And that really is important to distinguish, because when you come to have a conversation, you guys can be talking about the same exact thing, but be talking right past each other. It's exactly like the creation evolution debate. It's exactly like if you're debating an atheist and you're a staunch Christian. Sometimes you can look at one thing, one fundamental principle, and get something completely different after that. Okay, so Black Lives Matter sees a problem. They see an issue, but what's their paradigm? What are they trying to do with their worldview, and what are they doing to change it? So to begin, they see that there is systematic racism throughout all of the United States. There have been multiple efforts in the recent years to rewrite history. They are trying to show that racism is a founding principle to this country. And for instance, we see that with the police, right? There are a lot of arguments I'm seeing, and this is almost just coming from personal experience, but also on blacklivesmattermovement.com. You can go there and see what they stand for and what they're all about. But a lot of people are talking about defunding the police because it's systematic. And I've seen and heard a lot of Christians talk about what it means to help the Black Lives Matter movement. And although they say, hey, I know all cops aren't bad, but it's still it's just part of the institution. So they believe that one of their founding principles is that racism is through the entire institution. And so what that means is they need to change that. And the way they change that is by defunding them. Actually, I saw a report today that just came out, and I'm waiting for it to be corroborated. But Minneapolis and 9 city council members in the city of Minneapolis are looking to defund the police there. They're actually taking steps now to look to disband the police department as they look for alternative ways of keeping people safe. You let me know what that means. I'm still waiting to hear more about it. So what is the problem with this rhetoric? It's a defeatist kind of mentality to this rhetoric and to what they're pushing, and it leads to a couple things. So we looked at the broader picture. One of their major premises that are propelling this movement forward, and one of the effects of this premise, one of the effects of saying that America was based on racism and based on the principle of racism, is that we get a lot of defeatist mentality and attitude because of this rhetoric. And now you see white people being commanded to repent for their white privilege and also for being white in some cases. I've seen a couple of clips that have come out and where black people will track down a white person and say, "Well, are you going to apologize?" There's clips of people, groups of white people, either vowing to use their white privilege for good or repenting to black people, literally kneeling down before black people and praying before the Lord, saying, "Please forgive us our sins." And so there are dangers when a whole part of the nation is being guilt tripped. And I think it can lead to a lot of damages. It can be very damaging to a country. And here is an example: rioting and looting. Throughout all of the US, there was a period, about a 48-hour period. I mean, it's still going on right now, but not as bad as it was, where they were attacking the police on social media. The police didn't know what to do. So rioters and looters were able to get away with what they wanted. Not saying that this is part of the protests. These may not be the actual good protesters, the peaceful protesters, but this is what happens when you um, absolutely freeze the police force and the law-abiding citizens when they feel guilt-tripped and they don't know what to do. 15 people die because of rioters and looters, a number of policemen, but also a number of innocent citizens. And that's what you get from a movement that has a founding principle on national racism, institutional racism. Let me know your thoughts. I'd like to hear from you, but just speaking broadly, and I want to get into a specific example of where they see something, but they interpret it incorrectly. So normally right here, this is where an advertisement would be. If you listen through the month of May, we had Friedel Financial Coaching, which was such a blessing to have them back the show, and I hope that they benefited from that as well. But just a word for the listeners, since we're wrapping up season 2, we're taking a 2-week break at the end of here in the middle of June. But then when we come back after at the beginning of July, we may be going to 3 shows a week. This is a trial period here at the end of season 1 to see how well it could work in season 2, to hopefully provide more content and stay up to date on current events. So if you want to get in touch with me, please let me know what your thoughts were on season 1 and what would you like to see moving forward in season 2. Thank you very much, and let's get back to the show. So, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, is that you can have 2 completely differing opinions, 2 almost bipolar opinions on something that is very polarizing. And they can look at a similar statistic and draw completely different conclusions because of their paradigm and their worldview that they were working with. And Black Lives Matter sees an issue. And I think that there are problems. I think that there are problems in the US that no country is perfect. The United States is definitely not an exception to that rule. There are things that we can do better at this country. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to start this podcast, because I see ways of improving this country. And that starts at the local level. And that's what Black Lives Matter is trying to do to a certain extent. They're trying to make a big change locally and then nationally. Because they see statistics such as African Americans are in 2018, 27% of arrestees, this is coming from the FBI, the statistics that they released at the end of 2019 for the 2018 year, of the percentage of arrestees, 27% of them were African Americans. Now, if you look at the statistics, 70% of them are white. 70% of the arrestees are white. Now, that makes sense because 75% of the country currently is white or Caucasian. But then you look at the statistic of African Americans being arrested and you say, hold on, wait a minute, why is it almost double proportionately? So you look at it, and African Americans only make up about 13 to 14% of the American population, and they're getting arrested. They're of the amount of total amount of arrests, that's 27%. That just doesn't seem to add up. How is that so much drastically different? And so Black Lives Matter, just looking at this statistic, they can extrapolate, and they've gotten to the point where they are saying we need to defund the police because it just seems like police are targeting African Americans because that's what it seems like. And this is where you need to challenge the narrative. This is where I want myself, you guys, to just question what is being told in the media, because I don't think you're getting the whole story, because it has become increasingly apparent that they have their agenda and that's what they're pushing. So with this is an interpretation that I want to offer up to you guys. And I want to hear what you guys have to say, because I don't think that this is a flawless argument, but I think it is better. I think that it makes more sense to me, because it's hard for me to think that I think that there can be corrupt anything. There can be a corrupt police force, but I don't think it can be national. I don't think that every single police academy out there is training their police officers like, hey, you need to be racist. Like that is not part of their game plan. So um all that being said, I don't think that it makes sense for the entire institution of the police to be racist. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. And here is one reason why I don't believe that narrative. There are a number of gun control studies and statistics that came out recently, that this is, I think, from the Giffords Law Center. Like, I'll post it to the links in the show notes. Um, but they've come out, and this is coming from gun control people, gun control advocates, not necessarily people that I agree, but I think we can still use similar data to understand other things other than just gun violence. But the amount of roughly half of gun homicides, and I think this is 2015, so it might have changed a little bit, but roughly half of gun homicides throughout all of the US took place in urban areas. And to go along with that, 26% of America's total gun homicides took place to be even more compounded inside of that, other than urban areas. There are just high volumes of gun violence that take place in very specific neighborhoods. And to the point that 26% of total gun homicides happen in where just 1.5% of the country's population resides. And it just seems such a drastic comparison to draw. So it seems very drastic. And the study that I was reading from says that it's coming from, typically these are racially segregated, and the people that reside in these in urban areas are African Americans. And there's another another statistic that shows that 52% of all gun homicides take place with African Americans. And I believe that there is another FBI statistic, and I don't have it here in front of me, but that shows that um, the majority of gun violence happens from African Americans, perpetrated from by African Americans onto other African Americans. And in my eyes, the reason that there are maybe disproportionately more arrests just based on percentages, um, made by the police on African Americans is just because that's where the violence is right now. And that's not a racial thing. I think it's a cultural thing. I think Candace Owens put out a video recently uh, talking about George Floyd and all of the surrounding issues around that. And within those urban communities, criminals are upheld as almost like the heroes. They're almost glorified. And there are gangs and there are gang wars that happens that really up the total amount of gun violence perpetrated in those communities. So for me, I think it makes sense, because if there's violence there, that's where the police need to be and make more arrests. There should be more law needs to be carried out in the lawless areas, especially um, places where people are getting shot and killed. And that's, I think that makes more sense in my head, that there would be more arrests being made in those areas than we would think maybe in suburbia. So that is my uh, um, consideration for today. That's the questions that I have raised. I don't think that it's possible for an entire institution like that to be racist. Let me know your thoughts. Reach out to me at thelifegivenandreceived@gmail.com. And as always, remember that the life that has been given and the life that you have received includes every area of life. Current events is no exception. See you on Wednesday. God bless.